The state is one of the most destructive institutions man has ever devised. A fire that, at best, can be controlled for only a short time before it leaps over its improvised confinements and spreads its flames far and wide. Whatever promotes the growth of the state also weakens the capacity of individuals in civil society to fend off the state's depredations and therefore augments the public's multifaceted victimization at the hands of state functionaries. Nothing promotes the growth of the state as much as national emergency, war, and other crises comparable to war in the seriousness of the threats they pose. States by their very nature are perpetually at war, not always against foreign foes, of course, but always against their own subjects. The state's most fundamental purpose, the activity without which it cannot even exist, is extortion. The state gains its very sustenance from the proceeds of its extortion, which it pretties up ideologically by giving it a different name, taxation, and by striving to sanction its intrinsic crime as permissible and socially necessary. All governments are, as they must be, oligarchies. Only a relatively small number of people have substantial, relevant discretion to make critical decisions about how the state's power will be brought to bear. Beyond the oligarchy itself and the police and military forces that compose its Praetorian Guard, somewhat larger groups constitute a supporting coalition. These groups provide important financial and other support to the oligarchs and look to them for compensating rewards, channeled to them at the expense of the mass of the people. Thus, the political class in general, that is, the oligarchs, the Praetorian Guards, and the supporting coalition, uses government power, which means ultimately the police and the armed forces, to exploit everyone outside this class by wielding or threatening to wield violence against all who fail to pay the tribute the oligarchs demand or to obey the rules they dictate. Democratic political forms and rituals such as elections and formal administrative proceedings disguise this class exploitation and trick the masses into the false belief that the government's operation yields them net benefits in the most extreme form of misapprehension. The people at large become convinced that owing to democracy, they themselves are the government. Individual passage back and forth between the boundary of the political class and the exploited class testify, however, to nothing more than the system's cunningly contrived flexibility and openness. Although the system is inherently exploitative and cannot exist in any other form, it allows some leeway at the margins and the determination of which specific individuals will be the exploiters and which will be the exploited. At the top, a modest degree of the circulation of elites within the oligarchy also serves to mask the political system's essential character. It is a sound interpretive rule, however, that anything that cannot be accomplished except with the aid of threats or the actual exercise of violence against unoffending persons cannot be beneficial to all. The mass belief in the general beneficence of democracy represents a kind of Stockholm syndrome writ large. Yet, no matter how widely this syndrome may extend, it cannot alter the basic fact that owing to the operation of government as we know it, that is, government without voluntary, express individual consent, a minority lives on the balance at the expense of the rest, and the rest therefore lose on the balance in the process. While the oligarchs, elected or not, it scarcely matters, preside over the enormous web of criminal organizations we know as the state. Notwithstanding the ideological enchantment with which official high priests and status intellectuals have beguiled the plundered class, many members of this class maintain a capacity to recognize at least some of their losses, and hence they sometimes resist further incursions on their rights by publicly expressing their grievances, by supporting political challengers who promise to lighten their burdens, by fleeing the country, and most generally, by evading or avoiding taxes and by violating legal prohibitions and regulatory restraints on their actions, as in the so-called underground economy or black market. These various forms of resistance together compose a force that opposes the government's constant pressure to expand its domination. These two forces, working one against the other, establish a locus of equilibrium, a boundary between the set of rights the government has overridden or seized, and the set of rights the plundered class has somehow managed to retain, whether by formal constitutional constraints or by everyday tax evasion, black market transactions, and other defensive violations of the government's oppressive rules. Politics, in the largest sense, can be viewed as the struggle to push this boundary one way or the other. For members of the political class, the crucial question is always, how can we push out the frontier? How can we augment the government's dominion and plunder with net gains to ourselves, the exploiters, who live not by honest production and voluntary exchange, but by fleecing those who do so? National emergency, war, or a similarly menacing crisis answers the political class's crucial question more effectively than anything else, because such a crisis has a uniquely effective capacity to dissipate the forces that otherwise would obstruct or oppose the government's expansion. This fact alerts us to the most important aspect of state power, namely, that it ultimately rests on and ceaselessly magnifies people's fears. As Butler Schaeffer has written, quote, "Fear can debilitate us, making us susceptible to the importunities of those who promise to alleviate our fears if only we will give the direction of our lives over to them. In this manner, our institutions born with the state demanding the greater authority over us and promising release from our uncertainties." End quote. All animals experience fear, human beings perhaps most of all. Any animal incapable of fear would have been hard-pressed to survive regardless of its size, speed, and other attributes. Fear alerts us to dangers that threaten our well-being and sometimes our very lives. Sensing fear, we respond by running away, hiding, or preparing to ward off the danger. To disregard fear is to place ourselves in possibly mortal jeopardy. Telling people not to be afraid is giving them advice they cannot take. Our current psychological and physiological makeup predisposes us to fear of all sorts of actual and potential threats, however, even those that only exist in our imagination. The people who have the effrontery to rule us, who call themselves our government, understand this basic fact of human nature. They exploit it and they cultivate it. Whether they compose a warfare state or a welfare state, they depend on it to secure popular submission, compliance with official dictates, and on some occasions, affirmative cooperation with the state's enterprises and adventures. Without popular fear, can any government endure for more than a short period of time? One writer considers fear briefly in his analysis of the anatomy of the state, classifying its instillment as, quote, "another successful device by which the rulers secure from their subjects acceptance of, or at least acquiescence in their domination. The present rulers," it was maintained, "supplied to the citizens an essential service for which they should be most grateful: protection against sporadic criminals and marauders." End quote. But this writer, as most writers, does not view fear as the fundamental basis on which the rulers rest their domination. Of course, many scholars have recognized ideology as critical to the long-term maintenance of state power. Yet every ideology that endows the state with legitimacy requires and is infused by some kind of fear. It can be contended that public fear is a necessary, though perhaps not a sufficient condition for the viability of government as we know it. Now, the fear need not be of the government itself. and indeed may be of the danger from which the government purports to protect the people. Of course, some of the threats that induce subjects to submit to the government in the hopes of gaining its protection and thereby calming their fears may be real ones. It is not being maintained here that people who look to the government for their salvation act entirely under the sway of illusory threats. Although one must admit that nowadays, if not always, many public fears arise in large part, if not entirely, from stimulation by the government itself. If the people's fears may be 1. Of the government itself, 2. Of real threats from which the people look to the government for protection, 3. Of spurious threats from which people look to the government for protection, we must admit that the relative importance of each type of fear varies with time and place. In every case, however, the government seeks to turn public fear to its own advantage. If you enjoyed this video and you think others could benefit by viewing it, click that like button and share it on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. If you want to see more videos like this, as well as a mix of other content, give that subscribe button a click. For more information and additional content, let's connect on Facebook at facebook.com/highimpactflicks and reach out to me on Twitter at highimpactflicks. Until next time, remember, it's easier to deceive the masses than to convince them that they've been deceived.